Victoria stood alone in the spacious kitchen of her home in Portland, Oregon. It was a modern space, with marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that reflected the soft light of late afternoon. But today, it felt colder than usual, as if the warmth of the home had vanished along with the years of happiness she and Richard once shared. The wooden spoon in her hand stirred the sauce in slow circles as the scent of garlic filled the air. It was an aroma that used to bring comfort, but today it only intensified the lump in her throat. Silent tears streamed down her face as she tried to maintain composure. She didn't want Claire, her younger sister, to notice anything was wrong. Claire always saw her as the strong one, the one who had it all under control. But that was before Richard had changed. The metallic clatter of a pan hitting the sink brought her back to reality. She quickly wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater and adjusted the salt shaker on the counter, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. He wasn't always like this, she murmured to herself, feeling the weight of the memory. Richard, who once made her feel loved and admired, now seemed like a stranger. His words were no longer kind, they were sharp darts of criticism. Victoria closed her eyes as she recalled their latest argument. He had accused her of letting herself go, but his words hurt far more than any mirror ever could. The doorbell rang, interrupting her whirlwind of thoughts. Victoria took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by Claire's radiant smile, with her husband, John, standing just behind her, holding a box of desserts. "Hey, big sis," Claire exclaimed, pulling Victoria into a tight hug. "How are you?" Victoria forced a smile and replied, "I'm fine, just a little tired. But I've prepared an amazing dinner for you." She gestured for them to come inside, feeling the warmth of Claire's embrace as a brief relief. While Claire placed the dessert on the carefully set dining table, John approached Victoria with his usual calm demeanor. "Thanks for having us, Victoria. We needed a quiet evening like this." She nodded, but her mind was miles away. As the three sat down, the smell of dinner filled the simply decorated dining room. Richard hadn't arrived yet, but Claire began asking questions about life at home. Victoria skillfully deflected, talking about recipes, flowers in the garden, but she felt her sister's perceptive gaze. John, as always, kept the tone light, commenting on the best hiking spots in Oregon and trying to diffuse the growing tension in the room. But everything changed when Richard walked through the door. The door opened with a prolonged creak, and Richard stepped into the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. He paused briefly in the hallway, adjusting his tie and removing his tailored coat. The cold air he brought in seemed to invade the house. "Ah, Richard! Finally!" Claire stood up with enthusiasm, crossing the room to greet him. He responded with a polite but brief smile, accepting the hug stiffly. His eyes quickly found Victoria, who stood near the table, holding a wine glass with slightly trembling fingers. "You managed to make everything look so formal," Richard remarked, his eyes sweeping across the meticulously arranged table. His voice was low but carried a sharp undertone. "All this for Claire and John? Or is this an attempt to impress someone?" Victoria felt the sting of his words but maintained her smile. "It's just a family dinner," she replied, with as much control as she could muster. "I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to relax." Richard shrugged and headed straight for the bar in the corner of the room, pouring himself a generous glass of whiskey. "Well, I hope it works. We had a nightmare of a board meeting today." Claire, ever the peacemaker, tried to lighten the mood, pulling Richard into the conversation with her characteristic energy. "You always have the most interesting work stories. But let me tell you, Victoria went all out for dinner. It smells amazing." Richard muttered something inaudible and took a sip of his drink, already disengaged. Victoria felt the familiar chill of his indifference creeping back. They sat down for dinner. Victoria took the lead in the conversation, asking about John's work, Claire's recent travels, anything that could keep the focus away from Richard. For a few moments, it seemed to work. Claire laughed at stories about their childhood, and even John managed to inject a few light-hearted jokes. But, as always, Richard's presence loomed like a shadow. While everyone was engaged in an animated discussion about the best hiking trails in Oregon, he dropped a comment that seemed harmless on the surface but carried venom underneath. "Hiking is great, especially for anyone trying to get back in shape. Isn't that right, Victoria?" His soft laugh was accompanied by a cold glance in her direction. The room froze for a moment. Claire tried to laugh awkwardly but quickly glanced at her sister, sensing something was wrong. John, sitting beside Claire, straightened in his chair, his eyes now fixed on Richard. Victoria tried to mask the humiliation burning in her cheeks. "I do what I can," she said quietly. "Lately, I've been focused more on the house." "That's true," Richard quipped, taking another sip of whiskey. "You've got plenty of time for that, after all." Claire could no longer hold back. "Richard, I think Victoria does an amazing job. Look at this table, this dinner. I couldn't do half of this." Richard let out a short laugh. "Yes, she has a natural talent for these things." Victoria felt the lump in her throat grow. She was tired of being diminished, of every comment masked as a joke that cut deeper than she could admit. But, as always, she swallowed her pride, avoiding his gaze and focusing on the plate in front of her. John tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Victoria, you mentioned you were thinking about going back to fashion. That's incredible. I saw some of your pieces years ago, and I still remember how talented you are." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Richard interjected. "That would be an expensive hobby, don't you think? Maybe it's better she stays where she is. Focus on what's more important." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire squeezed John's hand under the table, silently signaling him not to push further. John, however, held his gaze steady on Richard, as if trying to measure the depth of the tension between the couple. "Well, I think we can all agree that talent is talent," Claire finally said, her voice carrying a hint of irritation. Victoria barely ate after that. Every bite felt heavy, and every word from Richard only added to the weight on her shoulders. Eventually, she decided to end the evening before things got worse. As they finished dinner, John helped Victoria clear the plates. Claire stayed in the living room, attempting to smooth over the evening with casual conversation. While washing dishes in the kitchen, John spoke softly to Victoria. "Does he always talk to you like that?" Victoria hesitated. "He's just tired. Work has been hard on him." John shook his head slowly. "That doesn't excuse anything." She didn't respond. She didn't know how. After another hour of strained conversation and forced smiles, Claire and John finally said their goodbyes. As the door closed, the house fell into an oppressive silence. Victoria lingered in the hallway, her arms crossed defensively. "Did you have to be so dramatic?" Richard said, leaning against the doorway to the living room, the whiskey glass still in his hand. They could tell something was wrong. "Maybe because you can't hold back your criticisms for even one night," Victoria replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Richard laughed, but without humor. "You always think you're the victim, don't you? Maybe you should look in the mirror. I'm not the only problem here." Victoria felt the tears returning, but this time something else stirred inside her. A spark, a small flicker of defiance that had long been extinguished. She took a deep breath. "Richard, I can't do this anymore." He narrowed his eyes. "Do what?" "This. Pretending. Pretending we have a marriage, that you still care about me, that I still care about you." For a moment, he was silent, processing her words. Then, he smirked coldly. "Ah, so that's it. You finally found the courage to blame someone other than yourself." Victoria didn't respond. She simply turned and walked upstairs, leaving Richard in the living room with his whiskey in one hand and his ego in the other. In that moment, she knew something had to change. She didn't know how or when, but she knew the breaking point was drawing closer. The next morning dawned cold, the gray light filtering through the bedroom blinds mirroring the heaviness in Victoria's chest. Richard had already left for work, leaving behind the usual trail of oppressive silence in his absence. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers interlaced over her knees, staring blankly ahead. There was a growing sense that time was running out, as if something about to crumble was inevitable. She slowly descended the stairs, passing through the kitchen. Remnants of the previous night lingered, Richard's nearly empty bottle of whiskey, the dishes she hadn't finished cleaning. The air still carried the faint aroma of garlic and herbs from the dinner, but now it felt cloying, even nauseating. Opening the refrigerator to look for something, her phone vibrated on the counter. She hesitated for a moment before checking it. It was a message from Claire. "Can I stop by today? Just to talk a little." Victoria took a deep breath. She didn't want to worry her sister, but at the same time, she felt suffocated by the loneliness of having no one to confide in. "Sure, I'll see you this afternoon." Later that day, Claire arrived, her usual vibrant energy contrasting with the cold atmosphere of the house. She entered cheerfully, carrying a bag of fresh croissants. "I hope you haven't had coffee yet," she said, setting the bag on the kitchen table. "I got these from your favorite bakery." Victoria smiled, but it was a tired smile. "Thanks, Claire. You always know how to brighten the day." Claire frowned, noticing the tone in her sister's voice. She sat down beside her and studied her for a moment before speaking. "Vic, are you okay? I mean, really?" Victoria stared at the counter, avoiding her sister's gaze. "I'm fine. Just tired. I think I need some time for myself." Claire wasn't convinced. "Vic, last night, Richard was awful at dinner. You know that, right?" "I only stayed quiet because I didn't want to make things worse." Victoria bit her lower lip, fighting back tears. She knew she couldn't keep hiding. "He's been like this for months, Claire. Maybe years, if I'm being honest." Claire held her sister's hand, her voice now filled with concern. "And you've been dealing with this alone? Why, you don't have to." "Because it's what I chose," Victoria interrupted, her voice shaky. "I chose to leave my career, I chose to trust him, I chose all of this. And now it feels like I have no other choice." Claire squeezed her sister's hand tightly. "Vic, that's not true. There's always a choice." At work, Richard was wrapping up another day of meetings, but the corrosive mood he cultivated at home was beginning to spill over into the office. His colleagues had noticed the change. He was more impatient, more domineering. Meanwhile, Victoria found inspiration in her conversation with Claire. That afternoon, after her sister left, she pulled out an old portfolio of fashion sketches from the closet. The scent of aged paper brought a wave of nostalgia, mixed with the pain of what felt like a life long gone. She spread the sketches across the dining table, studying the lines and forms. Each stroke represented a part of herself that had been neglected for years. One design in particular caught her eye, an elegant dress with a silhouette that seemed to flow, symbolizing freedom. "I can still do this," she murmured to herself. Determination began to take root. She opened her laptop and searched for fashion design contests and opportunities. Her eyes lit up when she found a local event, a community fashion show for emerging talent. It was small, but it felt like a possible fresh start. When Richard came home that evening, the house was quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted. Victoria was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She seemed calm, which unsettled him. Richard always believed he could predict her emotions, and her apparent composure threw him off. "Did you talk to Claire today?" he asked, pouring himself a whiskey. Victoria nodded without looking at him. "She brought croissants. It was nice to talk." Richard raised an eyebrow, sensing something different in her tone. "Did you talk about me?" Victoria stopped what she was doing and faced him. "We talked about a lot of things. And yes, Richard, you came up." There's no need to be defensive. He rolled his eyes and took a sip of whiskey. I know exactly what your sister thinks of me. She's never liked me. It's not about what she thinks, Victoria replied firmly. It's about how I feel. And, Richard, I haven't felt like myself in a long time. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but something in Victoria's gaze stopped him. It wasn't anger or sadness, it was something steadier, more resolved. In the days that followed, Victoria threw herself into preparations for the fashion show. She spent hours sketching, adjusting fabrics, and perfecting every detail. The spark in her eyes began to return, though she knew she would need more strength to face the consequences of her choices. One evening, as she worked in the makeshift studio she had set up in the guest room, Richard entered without knocking. "What's all this?" he asked, glancing at the fabrics and sketches scattered across the room. "I'm working," Victoria replied without looking up from her sewing. "Working on what?" He chuckled, but there was disdain in his tone. "I thought you gave up on these things." Victoria put down the needle and looked at him directly. "I didn't give up. I set them aside for a while. But now, I'm picking them up again. And if you can't understand why, that says more about you than about me." Richard stood silently for a moment, staring at her. "Are you blaming me for something?" "I don't have to blame you," Victoria said, turning back to her sewing. "You've done that on your own." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. But for the first time, Victoria didn't feel afraid or sad. She felt free. The community fashion show was fast approaching, and Victoria found solace in the fabrics and stitches she carefully wove together. Each seam in her design seemed to mend not only the fabric but also the pieces of herself that Richard had torn apart over the years. In the quiet of the guest room, now her improvised studio, she began to imagine what life could be like away from his control. But Richard was no fool. He noticed the change in Victoria. He watched her more closely, his attempts to belittle her now laced with a discomfort he couldn't name. He knew his influence over her was slipping away. One evening, while Victoria was perfecting the final details of a dress inspired by wildflowers, Richard confronted her again. He entered the room unannounced, his eyes filled with disdain. "Are you going to tell me what's really going on?" His voice carried an edge of accusation. Victoria sighed, not looking up from her work. "I'm creating something, Richard. Something for me. For you." He laughed bitterly, crossing his arms. "You think you can just reinvent yourself? After everything you've thrown away?" This time, she lifted her gaze, her calmness catching him off guard. "Yes, Richard. I believe I can." The morning of the show dawned crisp and bright. Victoria was awake before the sun, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and excitement. The dress she had chosen as the centerpiece of her collection was ready, neatly folded on the bed. It was simple yet sophisticated, a reflection of her essence. Claire arrived just before sunrise, knocking on the door with the boundless energy that always lifted Victoria's spirits. "Ready to shine?" she asked with a wide grin, holding 2 cups of coffee. Victoria accepted the coffee, a small but genuine smile forming on her lips. "Ready, but nervous." "That's normal," Claire reassured her. "Nervous means you care. And honestly, I can't wait to see everyone's faces when you walk on that stage." As Claire helped her load the dresses into the car, Richard descended the stairs, his face wearing its usual critical expression. He leaned against the doorframe, watching silently. As Victoria crossed the hall, he finally spoke. "It's today, isn't it?" He tried to sound indifferent, but there was a hint of bitterness in his tone. "Yes, it's today," Victoria replied without hesitation. "And what if it doesn't work out?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Have you thought about that?" Victoria paused, turning to face him. "I have. But what worries me more is not trying. That, Richard, would be the real failure." Claire, standing beside her sister, crossed her arms and glared at Richard. You know, maybe you should be there, Richard. See what your wife is capable of. But then again, you've never supported anything she's done, so perhaps it's better you stay home." Claire's jab made Richard scoff, but he didn't respond. Victoria felt her sister's silent support like a shield, and she walked out the door with her confidence intact. The venue for the fashion show was small but buzzing with energy. Models and designers rushed back and forth, the air thick with the excitement of last-minute adjustments. Victoria stood back, taking it all in with a nervous but growing sense of belonging. She hadn't been part of something like this in years, and the hum of voices and the rustle of fabrics transported her back to a time when she fully believed in herself. Claire stayed by her side throughout the preparations, helping arrange the dresses and ensuring Victoria ate something before the event began. "You look amazing," Claire said, gripping Victoria's shoulders and looking her in the eyes. "And no matter what happens tonight, you are amazing. Don't forget that." Victoria took a deep breath and nodded, feeling her sister's words bolster her courage. When the first models began walking down the runway, Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Each step they took carried more than just fabric. It carried her story, her struggle, her rebirth. The soft colors, elegant cuts, and meticulous details drew gasps and applause from the audience. At the end of the presentation, the MC called Victoria to the stage. With sweaty palms and a racing heart, she walked up the steps, Claire cheering loudly from the front row. As she turned to face the audience, her eyes glistened with tears. Standing under the bright lights and before unfamiliar faces, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: pride. Back at the improvised studio later that night, Victoria looked at the bouquets of flowers she had received and the notes filled with praise. She knew that the night marked the beginning of something new. But she also knew that to move forward, she needed to make a difficult decision. Richard came home late that night, and the silence in the house was deafening. Victoria sat on the couch, holding one of the bouquets, turning a flower between her fingers. "How was it?" he asked casually, as if he were inquiring about the weather. "It was incredible," she replied, her voice steady. "And it made me realize something." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Victoria lifted her gaze to meet his, her tone unwavering. "There's no room for you in my life anymore." He laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Oh, I see. One fashion show, and now you think you can just walk away." She stood, now face to face with him. "It's not about the fashion show, Richard. It's about what it represents. I've found myself again, and there's no place for you in that." The silence that followed was heavy, but Victoria didn't back down. Richard tried to respond, but his expression shifted to one of disbelief and, perhaps, a flicker of regret. He realized he was losing something he hadn't valued enough to hold on to. Victoria spent the next evening packing a suitcase with the essentials. This time, there was no hesitation, no room for doubt. When she walked out the door at dawn, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Claire was waiting in the car, waving enthusiastically. "Where to first?" she asked with a grin. Victoria took a deep breath, smiling back. "Wherever the road takes us." And with that, they drove away, leaving behind the shadows of an old life and heading toward a future still uncertain but brimming with possibility. The sun was rising over Portland as Victoria and Claire drove along the winding road, the first rays of light bathing the fields and mountains around them. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the gentle hum of the radio playing a soothing melody. Victoria gazed out of the window, watching the scenery pass, a strange blend of freedom and uncertainty swirling within her. "Are you really ready for this, Vic?" Claire asked finally, keeping her eyes on the road. "I mean, leaving it all behind, Richard, the house. It's a big step." Victoria turned from the window to meet her sister's eyes. "I've been leaving it behind for a long time, Claire. I just hadn't taken the final step." Claire nodded slowly, understanding the depth of what Victoria meant. She knew her sister had endured far more than anyone should and that this decision wasn't made lightly. After a few hours, they arrived at their destination, Cannon Beach, a charming coastal town. Its colorful houses, quaint local shops, and endless expanse of ocean offered a sense of tranquility Victoria hadn't felt in years. Claire parked near a cozy cafe, and they stepped out to feel the crisp, salty air. "It's beautiful here," Victoria said, taking a deep breath, feeling a lightness she thought she'd lost. "I knew you'd like it," Claire replied with a smile. "I thought it'd be a good place for you to figure out your next steps." They settled into a table by the cafe's window, overlooking the sea. Claire ordered hot coffees and croissants, while Victoria allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like ages. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed less complicated, less heavy. She knew the storm of emotions still lingered, but she could feel the calm slowly settling in. "So, what's next?" Claire asked, interrupting Victoria's thoughts. "What's the plan?" Victoria shrugged, stirring her coffee slowly. "I'm not entirely sure. But I know I need to start over, away from everything that held me back. Maybe even away from Portland." Claire frowned. "You're thinking about moving?" Victoria nodded. "Maybe. I love Portland, but everything there reminds me of Richard, and who I was with him. I need a place where I can truly find myself." Before Claire could respond, Victoria's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Richard's name. He hadn't tried to contact her since she'd left. Part of her had expected this call, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to feel. "Are you going to answer?" Claire asked, noticing her hesitation. Victoria took a deep breath. "I think I should. It's better to address this now." She swiped to answer the call, bringing the phone to her ear. "Richard." On the other end, his voice sounded different, almost hesitant. "Victoria, we need to talk." "I don't think there's anything left to talk about," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're wrong," he insisted. I've realized some things since you left. I know I'm not perfect, but—" "Richard," she interrupted, her tone now firmer. "I've already made my choice. And you need to respect that." The silence on the other end lingered, but finally, Richard sighed. "Do you really think you can rebuild everything on your own?" Victoria closed her eyes for a moment before responding. "No, Richard. I know I can. And honestly, I hope you can find something that makes you happy, too. But it won't be us. Not anymore." She ended the call before he could reply, placing the phone back on the table. Claire reached across to squeeze her hand, offering a supportive smile. "You did the right thing," Claire said. "And now you can move forward without those chains holding you back." In the days that followed, Victoria explored Cannon Beach, taking long walks on the white sand and gazing at the endless horizon. Each day felt like another step in the right direction, another step away from the weight she had carried for so long. One clear afternoon, while sketching in a notebook Claire had given her, she stumbled upon something unexpected. A small, welcoming art studio with a sign that read, "Haystack Creative Space." Curious, she stepped inside, greeted by the soft hum of instrumental music and the smell of paint and wood. A woman with gray hair and a warm smile approached her. "Welcome. We're organizing an event for local artists next month. Would you be interested?" Victoria hesitated. "Actually, I'm a fashion designer. I recently showcased a collection, but I'm still trying to find my footing." The woman's smile widened. "Well, then you're in the right place. Our event isn't just for painters or sculptors. Fashion designers are artists too." The words struck a chord with Victoria. It felt as though the universe was conspiring to give her another chance. She spent the afternoon talking with the woman, who introduced herself as Madeline, and left the studio with a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Claire watched Victoria with a knowing smile. "You found something, didn't you?" Victoria nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, a new beginning." The days in Cannon Beach flew by, each one adding a new layer of strength to Victoria's sense of self. Her mornings were spent walking along the shoreline, where the rhythmic crashing of waves seemed to wash away the remnants of doubt from her mind. Afternoons were dedicated to sketching and refining her designs, which were now proudly displayed at Haystack Creative Space, thanks to the welcoming embrace of Madeline. With Claire by her side, Victoria felt that, for the first time in years, she was charting a path that truly reflected her. There were no external expectations steering her direction, only the growing resolve to rediscover who she was. Madeline's upcoming event for local artists quickly took shape. The studio buzzed with energy as painters, photographers, musicians, and Victoria prepared to showcase their talents. Victoria's designs, displayed on mannequins, stood out for their elegance and quiet strength, mirroring the journey she'd undertaken. "You'll need a name for your brand," Claire remarked one afternoon, helping Victoria adjust one of the dresses on display. "Something that captures all this, everything you've built." Victoria pondered for a moment before replying, "Resilience." She smiled softly, the word feeling like the perfect embodiment of her story. "That's what all of this represents, standing firm, growing stronger, and moving forward." Claire beamed. "Resilience. It's perfect. Just like you." The night of the event arrived, and the studio was alive with light and sound. People filled the space, admiring the art, conversing in hushed tones, and soaking in the vibrant energy. Victoria's pieces, arranged with care, drew curious glances and murmurs of admiration. As the night unfolded, an older man in a sharp suit stopped in front of one of Victoria's designs. He traced the fabric lightly with his fingers before turning to her. "Are you the designer of these pieces?" he asked, his tone intrigued. "Yes," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm Victoria. These are part of a collection I'm working on." "Impressive," he said, extending a hand. "Anthony Reeves. I curate independent fashion events. What you've created here is special. Have you considered showcasing your collection in a larger show?" Victoria blinked, caught off guard. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." Anthony smiled. "I'm organizing a show in Seattle next month. It's focused on emerging talent. You should be part of it." Claire, standing nearby, lightly gripped Victoria's arm, her excitement barely contained. Victoria felt her heart race. It was an opportunity she hadn't dared to imagine so soon. "I'd love to," she said, her smile growing. "Thank you for this chance." Back at their rented home in Cannon Beach, the excitement of the evening still lingered in the air. Claire flipped through Victoria's sketchbook, her grin as wide as ever, while Victoria sat quietly, reflecting on what the night meant. "I told you," Claire said, setting the sketchbook down. "You're a natural. You just needed the right space to shine." Victoria exhaled, but this time it was a sigh of relief. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm on the right track. Like I've finally come back to myself." "That's because you have," Claire replied, pride evident in her voice. "And I couldn't be more proud of you." The days leading up to the Seattle show were a whirlwind. Victoria poured her heart into her designs, perfecting every detail. Each piece felt deeply personal, a manifestation of the strength she had reclaimed. Her work wasn't just clothing, it was a testament to survival, growth, and rediscovery. Madeline continued to serve as a mentor, guiding Victoria and connecting her with other artists who could collaborate on elements of her collection. "You've got something special, Victoria," Madeline said one afternoon, watching her work on a flowing, intricately detailed gown. "The world needs to see this." 2 days before the trip to Seattle, Victoria received a phone call from an unexpected number. She hesitated briefly before answering. "Victoria? It's Ethan." For a moment, she was stunned into silence. Ethan had been a dear friend from her past, someone who had always seen her potential, but they had lost touch during her years with Richard. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice soft with surprise. "It's been so long." "I saw the news about your event in Cannon Beach," he said, his voice warm and filled with genuine excitement. "Your designs are incredible. I wanted to tell you that I'm rooting for you." Victoria smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot coming from you. I'm in Seattle now," he continued. "If you need any help with the show, let me know." Victoria ended the call with a quiet smile. Somehow, it felt like her journey was reconnecting the scattered pieces of her past, present, and future. Ethan's reappearance reminded her of the connections she thought she had lost, connections rooted in who she truly was. As she gazed at her nearly completed collection, Victoria felt a new level of confidence. The Seattle show wasn't just a chance to showcase her work, it was a declaration of everything she had reclaimed. And for the first time in years, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The day of the Seattle fashion show arrived with an electric energy in the air. Victoria stood backstage in the bustling venue, surrounded by the buzz of activity. Models hurried to get dressed, hairstylists and makeup artists made their final touches, and designers like Victoria triple-checked every detail of their pieces. Her heart pounded, not with anxiety, but with exhilaration. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The collection, Resilience, stood proudly displayed on racks and mannequins, a visual representation of her journey. Each dress, blouse, and gown told a story of strength and rebirth. The centerpiece of her collection was an ethereal, flowing dress, designed to symbolize freedom and self-discovery. Its vibrant yet delicate details echoed Victoria's own transformation. Anthony Reeves, the curator who had invited her to participate, approached with a confident smile. "Victoria, your work is stunning. The crowd is going to love it. This is just the beginning for you." "Thank you, Anthony," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. She felt gratitude not only for the opportunity but also for the chance to redefine her future. The venue buzzed with anticipation as the audience filled the seats. Journalists, critics, and fashion enthusiasts murmured in excitement as the lights dimmed, signaling the start of the show. The first notes of atmospheric music played, and the first model stepped onto the runway, wearing a piece from Victoria's collection. Sitting in the audience, Claire watched with pride and barely contained emotion. She clutched her program tightly, her eyes fixed on the runway. "That's my sister," she whispered to John, who had joined her for moral support. As each model walked, Victoria's designs elicited gasps and nods of approval from the audience. The soft yet bold lines, intricate stitching, and harmonious color palettes captured their attention. These weren't just clothes. They were pieces of Victoria's soul, each representing a step in her reclamation of herself. When the final model walked the runway wearing the centerpiece gown, the audience erupted into applause. The collection had spoken to them, resonating with emotions that couldn't be put into words. The MC called Victoria to the stage, and as she stepped into the spotlight, her heart swelled. The applause grew louder as she walked to the center of the runway, her shoulders back and her head held high. Standing under the bright lights, she bowed gracefully, and as she lifted her gaze to the audience, her eyes fell on someone familiar in the front row. Ethan. He was clapping enthusiastically, his warm smile radiating pride. His presence brought a wave of emotions, reminding her of the unwavering belief he'd always had in her. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude, not only for Ethan but for herself, for finding the strength to reach this moment. After the show, the atmosphere in the VIP lounge was jubilant. Critics approached Victoria to praise her work, while industry insiders expressed interest in collaborations. Anthony introduced her to a renowned designer who complimented her collection. "You've captured something rare," the designer said, shaking her hand. "Your work is emotional, yet refined. It tells a story, and that's what fashion is all about." Victoria thanked them with genuine humility, but her attention was soon drawn to Ethan, who approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Can I steal the star of the night for a moment?" he teased, handing her a glass. She laughed, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Only if you make it quick. I'm in high demand." They walked to a quieter corner, away from the bustling crowd. Ethan raised his glass. To you, Victoria. Tonight was incredible. You've come so far. Thank you, she said softly. It means a lot to hear that from you. Ethan's gaze was steady and genuine. So, what's next? More runway shows? Taking resilience global. Victoria thought for a moment, a smile spreading across her face. I'll keep building my brand, of course. But more than that, I want to build a life that feels right for me. One where I don't lose myself again. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. If anyone can do it, it's you. Victoria looked out over the city skyline visible through the venue's large windows. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom and control over her life. Thank you for always believing in me, Ethan. Always, he replied, his sincerity evident. In the months that followed, Victoria's name began to rise in the fashion world. Her brand, Resilience, became synonymous with elegance, strength, and empowerment. Her designs gained a devoted following, and her story resonated with women who saw themselves in her journey. Ethan became an integral part of her new life, not just as a friend but as someone who truly understood her. Their bond deepened naturally, growing into a relationship based on mutual respect, admiration, and love. Claire, always her biggest cheerleader, remained her steadfast support. The two sisters shared every milestone, celebrating together as Victoria's career flourished. Years later, as Victoria prepared for another major runway show in New York, she looked back at the woman she once was. The pain and loss she had endured no longer defined her. What once had been a source of anguish had transformed into a foundation of strength. As she stood in front of the mirror, making final adjustments to her outfit for the evening, she caught a glimpse of the woman she had become. The elegance and confidence in her reflection mirrored the inner peace she now carried. Walking out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, Victoria felt the crisp air of a new chapter. No longer weighed down by the past, she moved forward with purpose. And this time, her story was entirely her own.